Hello and welcome to a very special How I Paint Things. Now what I've got in front of me today, pretty unmistakably, the Sensational She-Hulk. And what I wanted to do was something really out there compared to what I would normally. Now had suggested to me doing one of the Marvel Crisis Protocol miniatures, and She-Hulk just stood out as something unique. So what I've got here today is not so much a how-to as an experiment. A lot of what I'm doing, you'll see, is mostly making it up on the fly and having a bit of fun. Because I wanted that palette cleanser experience, you're going to see me mess things up and kind of adjust on the fly. It was a real change of pace, and I've thoroughly enjoyed it. So if you like the result, well, I'm going to show you how I did it. As always, all of the paints will be listed in the description below, so let's get started. So once you've got your miniature assembled, the first thing to do is to prime it. Now here I've used white Scar from Citadel, but you could also use matte white from the Army Painter. Something which is going to have a smooth finish to it is important because of the material that we're going to be using. Now I am quite interested to note that the Marvel Crisis Protocol miniatures, I thought they were resin, but they're actually plastic. And I tend to find that plastic reacts a little bit better to these express and contrast style colors, so that's quite interesting. It was also a lot easier to assemble than I was thinking. Folks have mentioned that a few of the MCP miniatures can be a little bit finicky, but She-Hulk here was an absolute doddle to assemble, and I'm really looking forward to painting her. Now, being that it's such a large part of the miniature, I'm going to start with her skin. Now for this, I'm going to start with Troll Green, and that's going to be quite a lot lighter than I want her final skin tone to be. But I get the feeling this is going to be the place to start from. So I'm using here, this is the Redgrass size 2 brush, which I've always found to be super good at applying these contrast style paints. So as much as possible, I'm going to keep my brush traveling in the same direction as I apply this. And I might have been better served by adding a little bit of medium, but we'll see how this leg dries first. Now once that's dried, you'll see how that actually settles really nicely into all of the crevices and musculature of particularly her arms. That is just one coat of that stuff over white. But it did turn out much darker than I was planning. I mean, there's nothing wrong with that green. I think that looks pretty cool, but it isn't quite what I was imagining, so I'm now going to experiment and have a bit of a play around. One quick note I did notice is they mention ordinarily with the Army Painter's speed paints not to use them on a wet palette. Now with the Express I was just using, that Troll Green, I did notice that as I was getting up around her face, you might see a slight difference in tone as it was starting to thin down as I was using it. Now it was a fairly slight difference, but the wet palette obviously is going to slowly thin out the Express as you're working with it. Now luckily it reacts quite well to being thinned out. I'm going to play with that in a couple of seconds here. Now what I'm going to do first is I've got one of my makeup brushes and I've loaded it up with just a little bit of off-white. Now you could use a pure white here, it's just what I grabbed and had to hand. What I'm going to do is very lightly dry brush along the tops and the really exposed areas of her musculature, because while this is a fine green, I wanted something slightly different. So we're going to experiment here and see what we get by changing things up a bit. So you'll see, passing over the same area very lightly a few times to build up some of those highlights. And we're going to play around with glazing some of this in a second. So after a couple of passes, I went on down to a smaller brush to get in behind her face there and up on the top of her arms. But what we've got now is a little bit more in the way of depth and highlighting, which we're going to use by glazing now. So let's pop it to the side, and I am going to mix up. I have here Orc Skin, which I probably should have started with. Now I've mixed that Orc Skin about 2 parts medium to 1 part of the color, and now I'm going to apply that over the top of her skin. That's more, that's more of what I had in mind. Ah, that's cool. Okay. So I'm now going to cover over all of her skin with this. Now once that Orc Skin glaze has dried, now we're cooking. That's the sort of tone that I really wanted. What I've got in the background here is now a purple. This is deep purple, and I've watered this down about 8 parts medium to 1 part of the purple. I really want this to be quite subtle. What I'm going to do is get some more of it off my brush and just run this around the deeper areas of her musculature. Just feather it out with a little bit of water if I need to. But purple and green actually work really well together, so any areas that you want to be just a touch more pronounced, what you can do is purple them up a bit, and when that dries, it's going to be subtle, but still noticeable. Now we're cooking. What I've got here is Templar white, and I'm going to apply this over, well, the white parts of her bodysuit. Now this I'm going to do now because I figure it will be easier to apply the purple over the top of this if we make any mistakes. So I'm just going to quickly paint in the center section, and also her shoes I think have got this white stuff on there as well. Now just like something as Apothecary White would give us some shading to that white, so too does Templar White work very well. But I am going to highlight it with a little actual white, and here I'm going to use matte white from the Army Painter. The reason being, with these contrasts and these one-and-done style paints, I tend to find that the Army Painter's white has the nicest, sort of smoothest consistency when it goes on over the top of these. So you'll see I'm not doing a huge amount, I'm really just catching high points and getting rid of some, one of the tide marks I got on her chest there, because I did spend a little too long leaving it sitting there without moving it around. So my fault there. But as you see, it takes us a second to get a bit of depth to this. Now, unfortunately, I managed to paint a tiny wee bit of thread or something onto her stomach there, so that's a pain in the neck, but that's not the paint's fault, that's me not paying attention. Now, on her box, the miniature that they've painted is got quite a dark purple, but the little comic strip version they've got of her is a slightly more sort of fuchsia version, and I like the fuchsia instead. So I'm going to use deep purple, same as we already have done, and very carefully come up towards the edges of this trim. Okay, definitely painting one panel at a time is the way that you're going to get the best result here. So I am now going to, go ahead with that. I found it was easiest to load my brush up with a little bit more than I thought I would need, and start from the center and spread it out. All right, now that's come out really well. I'm honestly quite surprised about how easily that goes on. What I have done is to come back with a little bit more of the deep purple and just paint some of the lines under the recesses or into the crevices. The way that the miniature actually assembles, unfortunately, there are 1 or 2 parts, particularly on her legs, where the join is quite conspicuous if you don't fill it with a bit of glue. Now, I didn't think ahead to do that, so it has affected the painting a little bit, but I'm not too worried. What I've got now, this is an equal mix of lizard green, black lotus, and the medium, and we're going to paint her hair with this. And I am hoping that this is going to go over... okay. Now, while it dries, I might be onto something. That's looking quite cool. I'm going to use the same mix to very carefully paint in her eyebrows, and I am also going to put a little bit of this on her bottom lip as well. And as that's dried, that actually looks a lot closer to what I had in mind, so maybe I didn't need to leave out the medium. I'm happy with that. What we're going to do now is the base and the beam that she's carrying. So what I have here is London Grey. This is a VALLEJO model color, grey, and you'll see we're not being terribly careful with it. We're just going to jam this over the whole base. Slow down a little when you come near her shoes, of course, but otherwise, away we go. Now, while that's drying, you can grab yourself a metallic color you like. I have here plate mail metal from the Army Painter, and I'm just going to jam this over the beam. You'll probably see you get a little bit of the white streakiness showing through, so this is one we're going to need to come back and give a second coat. But luckily, you see, it goes on quite easily. Now once that's dried, I've got a big old brush, and we have the new Game Color Black Wash. Now, the reason why I'm using these ones is that they dry so matte, and we're just going to throw this over all of the concrete, and funnily enough, over all of the steel as well. Now, once that's dried, you're going to have a ton of shading, but that's going to be quite dark. Don't worry though, we are going to fix that up. But concrete's never just grey, so what I have is the Umber wash as well. And notice I've got a properly scraggly old brush here. What I'm going to do is just splatter kind of randomly and then dab it around with my finger to get some uneven patches of brown, just a little bit of colour. Don't worry if your black is not perfectly dry either, because if this mixes together, all the better. You can do the same thing too with the metal. Probably want to do just a little bit less up here, but it's worth doing just to make this a bit more interesting. Now once those are both dry, you'll see I've taken her off the little cork here, because now I'm going to quite roughly dry brush the base. I've got here the Citadel dry version of Dawnstone, and I'm just going to jab this fairly generously onto the base. And in some areas, I'm going to quite generously stipple it on so that I've got some cleaner patches while leaving some of the grimier brown stuff in the recesses, and you get a nice gradation of color there. And then without changing or cleaning my brush, I'm going to go to Tyrant Skull and just do some little patches of this right at the edges where I want a slightly dustier appearance. Now it's important with this one, you've really only got just a tiny wee whisper of it in your brush. And then I'm going to get some VALLEJO steel and do the same thing with, well, the steel. This time though, instead of dry brushing the whole thing, I'm just going to lightly dab at some areas to get a nice uneven finish. Then the very last thing I'm going to do is I have here some red leather, mixed about 5 parts water into that to make sort of a shade. What I'm going to do is just paint little bits of this into some of the cracks and crevices on this steel. Now, because I assume when the Avengers are out fighting and She-Hulk's tearing buildings to pieces, they're probably not terribly old, so you don't need to go crazy with the rust effects here, but it will look cool and it adds just a little bit of visual interest. As well, you can even jab a little bit of this onto areas on the base if you want a slightly patchy, grubbier finish around these bits. Now all that remains is to paint the rim of her base black, and then I'm going to take her outside and hit her with a matte varnish spray. Let's get a look at what she looks like when she's all finished. So there at last, She-Hulk is complete, and I say it all the time, but I really had a lot of fun painting her. As far as a palette cleanser goes, you can't get much further away from khaki drab and ultramarines than Marvel superheroes. And what a fun one to pick. I really enjoyed painting something so bright. So hopefully something here was interesting to you. Now, obviously, all of this will still work with contrast or speed paints. I do just find that as I'm experimenting with them a little bit more, the Express paints tend to go on a bit smoother, and the way that they collect is a little bit more predictable, so I particularly like that. So as always, thank you very much to my wonderful patrons, including my producers, Alan, Kyrie, Rod, Jimmy, and Phil. And Andrew. Goodness me, there's 6 of them now. And as well, thank you very much to Exit 23 Games for the light and sound equipment, and everyone who is liking, sharing, subscribing, clicking all the right buttons. Thank you very much. Any questions or anything, feel free to drop them into the old comment box below. My Twitter and Instagram are both linked there too. So thank you very much for your time, one and all, and you all enjoy the rest of your day.